This week, we're talking about pleasure and gratification.
You are listening to Love Your Job Before You Leave It, the podcast for ambitious, high-achieving women who are ready to stop feeling stressed about work and kiss burnout goodbye forever. Whether you're starting a business or staying in your day job, this show will give you the coaching and guidance you need to start loving your work today. Here's your host, career coach Corey Lynn.
Hey, y'all. Happy Wednesday. We have a great topic to talk about today, and something that I think sometimes is overlooked, which is interesting since it also sort of runs a lot of our lives. And that something is pleasure and gratification. So something I see a lot in the coaching industry is teaching people how to delay gratification and teaching people how to tolerate and navigate discomfort in order to make new choices, make changes, and create a life that's different than the one we already have. And that is what a lot of people have as a goal, is to be able to do things they aren't currently able to do, to create results they're not currently creating. And that is great. But another thing I see, and specifically with my clients, specifically with people who are overachievers, perfectionists, people pleasers, is a lot of us are actually incredibly good at delaying gratification. And we just delay it and delay it and delay it and achieve and achieve and achieve and do and, overthink and all this other stuff. And so I think it's an important skill to know how to delay gratification. Don't get me wrong about that. That is an important skill. But I also think it's important to know how to not delay it, to know how to experience pleasure in the now. Something I see a lot is that my particular clients want to imagine this future where they've achieved all the things and they've done all the changes and everything's the way they want it to be. And they imagine being so gratified, so pleased then, but they're in such a hurry to get to that future place that they don't allow themselves to experience any pleasure in the now. And there's a few reasons that this is a problem. And reason number one is we're never getting to the imaginary place where everything's all figured out, because once you figure out the things you're working on now, first of all, the brain has hedonistic adaptation, which means it will adapt to whatever beautiful, yummy things we bring into it. And then the brain also likes to move the goalposts, because it'll be okay, this is all the normal now. And I want this other thing that current you can't even imagine, but future you, once future you has achieved current you's goals, then it can imagine other things it wants to achieve. So it wants to keep achieving, right? It's like a treadmill. And then the other thing is when we don't practice a skill, we don't tend to be very good at it. And I talk about this all the time, but I'm just going to say it again. A lot of us don't think that experiencing pleasure is a skill, but I think it is a skill. I think experiencing pleasure is a skill. I think experiencing satisfaction is a skill. Pleasure and satisfaction, I think, have some overlap, but I don't think they're 100% the same. But I think we need to practice both in order to have more of what we want. And I think so often we think what we want is the changes we're trying to make to our lives. And listen, don't get me wrong, we're going to work on that shit too. Yes, I left my corporate job. I started this business. I've turned it into a multiple six-figure business. Whatever big changes you're trying to make, don't worry, we're going to get to those. But my point is, once you achieve all that shit, which, listen, I know you can if that's what you want to do, but once you achieve all that shit, you're still going to be you. You're still going to be a human being. You're still going to have a human brain. Life is still going to be 50-50. We're still going to live in the world we live in now. Hopefully we'll have made some, beneficial adjustments to the world, but it's still generally going to be this world. And so if we're setting ourselves up thinking I'll just be happy once it's all perfect, we're really setting ourselves up for misery, because it's never going to be perfect. And if we don't practice pleasure, if we don't practice satisfaction, if we don't practice enjoyment, if we don't practice joy and happiness, we're not going to have that skill set later. Now, listen, I know some of y'all probably want to fight me on this because you're no, Corey, I changed this other shit and then I was happy. And to that, I'm going to say, for how long though? Because I do agree that generally, when we achieve something, even if we haven't practiced happiness and satisfaction for 5 minutes, we do feel completely fucking elated. We're like ecstatic. We're like, fuck yeah. But what I've also seen again and again, like not just with my clients and my friends, but in my own life, in my own mind, is I'm like fucking ecstatic and elated for 5 minutes. And then my brain's like, hi, I found 68 more things for us to like worry about. And I know 2 years ago, I told you that like we could be happy and satisfied if we did this, but now that we've done it, I like want to do these other things. Like I have a little sniffle on my nose, so I can't actually be happy. Or like something that's been happening lately with me is my knee's been hurting. And so I'm like going to physical therapy and stuff about it. But like my brain was like, oh yeah, you've like built, the career of your dreams and you built the business of your dreams. And like you live in this beautiful city where it's like sunny almost all the time, but now your knee hurts. So everything is ruined. And I was just like, cool, brain. Thank you for that input. So this is what life with a brain is like, is the brain will pretend everything's going to be great later. But then when later comes, then later is now. And in the now, there's always something that we can fixate on that's not working. And again, with negativity bias, that is usually what our brain will try to fixate on. So learning how to create enjoyment, and I'm saying create because I do think it's an inside job. Like the circumstances of your life don't create enjoyment. I know a lot of people think they do, but they don't, because your brain can always find something else to be unhappy about and to be disappointed about. So you have to create that enjoyment, right? It's a little DIY. You got to build it yourself. And I think it's also about learning how to experience pleasure in the now and not just pleasure in imagining a future. And I think this is like kind of a subtle idea. So I'm going to like spend a little more time on it because I think 5 years ago, me would not have understood this at all. But something I've seen a lot in my own life is that my brain is very good at imagining pleasure at a later time when things are different. For people who are single, it's imagining pleasure when they're partnered. For people who are in a job they don't like, it's imagining pleasure either in a new job, or often it's imagining pleasure in this imaginary life where they're financially independent. I experienced that a lot back in the day, and I see a lot of other people experience that too. Or it's like imagining pleasure when their body is different, or it's imagining pleasure, once they move to a different city, or imagining pleasure once they complete like the degree they're in or the assignment they're on. And again, we're going to do all that shit. Like we're going to work on all your actual goals, but there's a big difference between imagining future pleasure and putting that pleasure off and experiencing current pleasure and finding ways to take pleasure currently in your life, in what's going on now, versus always deferring that to a time when things will be different. And so part of this is about actually being able to experience pleasure. Part of this is also about like it's like the organizational piece of like, are you giving yourself any time for pleasure? So for some of us, we'll give ourselves time for pleasure, but we won't really like enjoy the pleasure because we know how to fantasize and we don't know how to actually enjoy the now. And then for others of us, we don't even give ourselves time for pleasure now because we're so good at delayed gratification that we're just like working. And maybe you're a little bit of both. I'm personally a little bit of both. Like something that I taught myself to do when I was a lot younger was to prioritize getting work done so that I could enjoy myself later. And like that is a life skill that can be useful. If all you're doing is experiencing pleasure and never getting work done, I do think there are often some negative consequences to that. And eventually it gets to the point usually where people, if they're doing only that, they run out of resources, or like I got myself in a lot of trouble because I would like prioritize pleasure instead of like sleeping. And then in college, I got pneumonia, right? Because I didn't sleep because I was prioritizing other things. So being able to delay that gratification is an important skill set. But if that's all you're doing, then I also think that's part of why people get into like fuck it effect. They get into like burnout. They get into like what I often refer to as the pit of despair, because they're living this life that's no fun, where all they're doing is working all the time. And like often when we're in that space, we like stop and we're like, what the fuck is the point of any of this if I never get to have fun? And we kind of like look at life like it's the problem. Like, fuck you, life. You're not any fun. And listen, there are life circumstances in this world, in this incarnation, that do put people in very difficult positions. I agree. And also for a lot of people, they're doing that to themselves maybe in addition to like the external circumstances and maybe not in addition. And this is like also where things like kind of overlap with socialization, because as women, we're socialized to do everything for everyone and to do everything for everyone before we do anything for us, right? So women are socialized to like feed everyone and like not be able to relax if the house isn't cleaned and like da 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 da. But like there's always more shit you could be doing, right? So if you're waiting to give yourself some pleasure until all your shit's done, you're never going to get to have any fucking pleasure because all the shit will never be done. And even if you did manage to get all the shit done, then your brain will just like come up with some other shit, right? I see this all the time in work lives and in personal lives, right? Where people, their brains will just come up with more things to do because we live in a world where like there often, is more we could do, but just because there's more you could do doesn't mean there's more you should do. And if all we're ever doing is prioritizing work and deprioritizing pleasure, again, that's not a very fun way to live life. And I think there is really kind of an existential question in here that I can't answer for you and only you can answer for yourself, which is like, what's the fucking point of life anyways? What's the point of any of this? What's the point of all of this? Right? Like, what is the point of your life? And what do you want from your life? What do you want your life to look like? What do you want your life to feel like? And again, some of this is like going back to the goals and like, oh, I want to like quit this job and get a different job and I want to make this much money. But some of this is about like the emotional experience and like the texture of your life and what you think the point of all of it is. I do not think the point of my life is to like do all the things that could be done and to like have the cleanest house. Listen, I want my house to be like clean, but I think pleasure is a big part of life as well. I think that's part of what makes life meaningful and part of what makes life fun. I do think like for each of us, we have to figure out our own balance of like how much pleasure is satisfying and then how much work is also satisfying. To me, all work and no pleasure, not satisfying. All pleasure and no work, interestingly to me, is also not satisfying. It turns out I like work. I like creating things. I like building stuff to give to y'all, to give to the world. I think a lot of us get confused and think like, oh, I just work because like that's how I get money and I have to have money to like support myself. And listen, we live in capitalism, so there is some truth to that. But I give a lot of thought like back when I was at Expedia to like, what are the other reasons to work? What are the other things I get out of work? And I think humans like effort. I think a lot of us resist effort because we think we have to do it. And anytime we tell ourselves we have to or we should, then we like resist it because let's be honest, like we don't like being told what to do. It's like we want to be told what to do, but we also don't like being told what to do, or at least that's how it is for me. But when I take away all of that, I like work. I like working. I like creating things. But again, to me, it's about building balance. It's just like, the way I eat, I like to think about like a balance of like, what's going to be nourishing for my body. Like that's just kind of how I do things. And I like to eat like a lot of veggies and fruits because I like actually not that many fruits, mostly just veggies because I like how my body feels when I do that. And I like what the science says about doing it. And I think like, what if life is like that too? Like, I think some of us are like, well, I have to, work all the time. It's like the equivalent of being like, well, I have to like eat all this fucking kale. But I'm like, I don't like kale, so I don't really eat kale. So that's like why I'm making this example. You don't have to eat all the kale. You don't have to work all the time. Like you're allowed to make up your own rules and you're allowed to have pleasure. And I would offer to you that like a little bit of pleasure can go a long way if it's true pleasure. I think a lot of us also get confused about like what's pleasurable versus like what we want to do because we've been told not to do it, right? Like again, it's like I actually think humans like to work, but we resist working because, it's like all tied up with our worthiness and with the shoulds. And I think pleasure kind of has like an opposite thing where we're like a lot of us will put pleasure off because we think it has all these negative connotations, like pleasure is like bad or sinful. And I think others of us kind of overload ourselves with pleasure because it's like that we're not supposed to. So then we like crave it out of that rebelliousness. Anyways, this is like a kind of twisty and complicated podcast, which is I think 100% what all of my podcasts are like. But I think at the most basic, the message here is if you want to experience pleasure in your life, like what if we build that into every day instead of like trying to wait and have it all later? And then it's like later we can't even have it because we don't know how, and we can't metabolize it. Like if you want to experience pleasure, like what if we start now? And what if you like tinker with it and figure out like what is an amount of pleasure to be having like frequently, regularly in your daily, everyday life that feels like good and nourishing to you, that makes your life feel flavorful and interesting and worthwhile and yummy and fun. So if you're really good at delaying gratification, it might be like, how do I incorporate more gratification? How do I incorporate more pleasure? How do I like pepper that in? Like what is the right ratio for me that feels really enjoyable? And then I still get other stuff done that matters to me. Or if like you're really good at, doing a lot of pleasure and less good at delaying gratification, then maybe you're like, ooh, like maybe I want to like learn this skill of delaying gratification, not so I can delay all of it, but just so I can delay it sometimes for a little bit to like, do whatever the other things are that matter to me too. And I think at the heart of all of this, like I was saying before, is what kind of life do you want to live? What is the purpose of life for you? And this may sound like a really big question, but I think it's really important because I think so many people are living by other people's rules and by other people's ideas of what a good life is. And at the end of their life, they're like, what the fuck? Why didn't I blah, blah, blah? Why did I do this other thing? And I do think like having some regrets is normal. And I've talked about regret on the podcast before, but I also think like taking the time to do the difficult mental work of like figuring out what the fuck you want your life to be for your own self and then making your life that way can also alleviate a lot of that. So many of us are running our lives based on what we think we should be doing. And that makes sense. We're social mammals and we all have like deep enculturation, but also like you don't have to fucking do that. You get to do your life your way. Like that is your right. You have free will. And I know it doesn't always feel that way, but I think it's really powerful to remind yourself that that's there and that you get to decide what a good life is and what the role of pleasure is in that and what the role of work is and what the role of delayed gratification is. It's all up to you. That doesn't mean you have to do it on your own though. I think that this work can be very brain melting and very paradigm shifting and like deeply uncomfortable sometimes, if I'm being really honest. And I think that's why so many people do hire coaches. Like a coach doesn't know all your own answers. I actually think you know all your own answers, but a coach can help you navigate them and get to them and like sift through them and decide what you want to do about it. And if you are looking for a coach, I would love to talk to you about that. I'm currently accepting clients to work with me one-on-one. And when this podcast airs, I think my group coaching program will be sold out, but feel free to check in with me just to follow up if you would rather have that option. And yeah, like let's coach on it. Let's solve your big questions and figure out your big answers. And then let's make your life something truly amazing to you. Full of pleasure, full of the ability to delay gratification if you want it, full of all the things that you want, and with all the skills to handle the things that you don't that are part of this life. All right, y'all, that's what I have for you this week. Have a lovely week. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Love Your Job Before You Leave It. We'll have another episode for you next week. And in the meantime, if you're feeling super fired up, head on over to CoreyLynn.com for more guidance and resources.